Your parents are poor. Kids living in the same high-rise apartment taunted my daughter, Sandra, without getting bored. She must have been mentally exhausted from hearing these sneers every day. But today, she wasn't crying. Unexpectedly, she smiled at me. The ones crying were the high-floor residents who had looked down on our family. I see. Apparently, our strongest Sandra did something to these people. That's what you get for trying to assert dominance based on the floor you live on in a high-rise apartment. My name is Wendy. I am a 48-year-old who has recently become obsessed with having snacks during little breaks. A few years ago, our family of 3, my 10-year-old daughter Sandra, my husband Andrew, and I moved into a high-rise apartment. Before Sandra started middle school, we decided to move to a safer place, even if it would strain our budget a bit. That's how we ended up choosing this high-rise apartment. It's not like we were particularly fixated on living in a high-rise. But with a concierge at the entrance and enhanced security, I thought this environment would be safer for young Sandra. We chose the 5th floor. If anything were to happen, this height seemed reasonably safe. Moreover, it's easy to get outside. The cost was not cheap, but compared to the higher floors, it was more affordable. If this ensured our family's safety, it was worth it. The school was nearby, and it was convenient for Andrew to commute to work. Shopping was easy, and public transportation was readily accessible. Although expensive, I thought we had found a great place to live. I realized the unpleasant side of this high-rise apartment right after we moved in. Since we had moved to such a lovely high-rise, we decided to explore and enjoy the common areas as a family. New faces, I see. A woman in a suit approached us with her child as we wandered around. She appeared older than me. However, the fact that she confidently chose to wear a skirt instead of pants suggested that she was a person with great self-confidence. Nice to meet you. We just moved in. I'm Wendy. I greeted her. Andrew and Sandra followed my lead and introduced themselves. Sandra is the same age as my child. Oh, is that so? That's great, Sandra. You have a friend the same age. The woman introduced herself as Rebecca. Her child, Tina, was apparently the same age as Sandra. It was a happy encounter for Sandra, who had no friends yet since we had just moved. Tina attended a private school. Sandra went to a public school, so I felt a bit disappointed that they wouldn't be able to be friends both at home and school. Rebecca seemed to be well connected with people in the high-rise. As we talked, more and more people approached us, and Rebecca kept including us in conversations, saying, "This is Rebecca. They just moved in." I thought she was a nice person. By the way, Wendy, which floor do you live on? A person who had been nodding at everything Rebecca said asked me. The 5th floor. Huh? I didn't miss the look of surprise on their faces when they heard my answer. I didn't think I had said anything strange. But they seemed to think otherwise. Are you really living on the 5th floor? They asked with a suspicious look. Yes, the 5th floor. Immediately, Rebecca's group sighed in unison. Andrew and I were puzzled by their reaction, thinking, what's going on? What a waste of time. One of Rebecca's followers said, walking away from her. Several people agreed with her and left as well. To be precise, they didn't leave Rebecca. They left us. Sorry, we live on the higher floors, Rebecca said, with a smile that didn't seem apologetic at all. Honestly, Andrew and I had no idea what she was apologizing for. Were we being looked down on for living on a lower floor? I thought such things were just urban legends. As Andrew and I were bewildered, Rebecca said to Tina, "Tina, Sandra lives on the 5th floor, so you shouldn't play with her." Then, even Tina stood up. "Okay," she said, leaving Sandra to run over to another child. "See you," Rebecca said with a smile as she walked away from us. The residents of this high-rise apartment might be a bit strange. That impression was just the beginning. 2 weeks later, I was enjoying a leisurely day off at home when Sandra came back crying. "Sandra? What happened?" Sandra was usually very tough. When she was 3, she fell at the park and only frowned without crying, a story we've often told with pride. For her to come home crying, something serious must have happened. On my way back from school, they sang a song calling me poor. What? Apparently, they had made up a song mocking her for being poor and sang it as a group. What tasteless children. But the issue isn't their lack of creativity. Sandra's elementary school didn't have kids from the high floors, but it did have some from the middle floors of this high-rise. These children, along with their parents, seemed to follow Rebecca's lead. Rebecca looked down on us from the lower floors, so the middle floor residents did the same. In a way, they were straightforward people. It might seem like a minor issue, being mocked with a song, but Sandra was already nervous from the change in environment. After the incident in the common area, this was too much, even for tough Sandra. Seeing her cry, I began to regret moving here. We had chosen this place for the family's sake. After sobbing for a while, Sandra said, "And then Kristen told me to leave the high-rise." What? Kristen seemed to be the leader of the middle floor kids. The leader of the high floor group, both kids and adults, was undoubtedly Rebecca's family. Her family was very subservient to Rebecca's. "You had a tough time, Sandra. Don't let it bother you. Stay strong." I comforted her. "No, it's Kristen who will leave." What? Why? Kristen's dad is in trouble, so they'll leave next week. I couldn't understand Sandra's words, so I asked her, "Where did you hear that? And what do you know?" Sandra said, "I saw it in a dream. Kristen's family will leave." A week later, Kristen's family vanished from the high-rise. With no information coming in, we could only speculate, but it seemed like they had fled overnight. A few days later, a news report showed Kristen's dad, the president of a company, being arrested. It was for embezzlement and fraud. He had been using customers and the company's money to live in the high-rise. Of course, we couldn't have known that. Sandra's prediction gave me goosebumps. She had always had a bit of a mysterious power. She could foresee the future. However, she couldn't control this ability, so it wasn't as if she could see what she wanted to see. It just came to her in dreams. She often said, "I wish I could see the answers to tests." I was glad she didn't have that ability. Thank you, God. With the middle floor leader gone, their attitude towards Sandra softened, and things improved for a while. But then, the high floor group started to badmouth not only Sandra but also Andrew and me during our commutes. "I hate living in the same high-rise as poor people. It lowers the value of this place. Why don't they just move out already? Craving a lifestyle beyond their means is typical of poor people." And so on. How can they act so superior just because of the floor they live on? If they want to assert their dominance so badly, they should live in a high-rise where there are only high floors. Without the lower floors, their living situation wouldn't exist. Andrew and I found it too ridiculous to pay attention to such gossip, but Sandra seemed to be struggling. Seeing Sandra in pain was harder for us, and we wanted to help her somehow. Moving might be the quickest solution to resolve the situation. It seemed Sandra was also having trouble with her school relationships. She was in the same class as the middle floor kids. Because they looked down on Sandra, even the kids not living in the high-rise started avoiding her. It wasn't long before a withdrawn Sandra said, "I don't want to go to school." And Andrew and I began to think about changing her school. But we had just moved, and we both had jobs. We were pondering what to do when an incident occurred. That day, Sandra woke up with a big smile and asked, "Mom, what's for breakfast?" Recently, she had been waking up with a gloomy face or not coming out of her room at all. I couldn't help but smile back, and instead of just toast, I made her favorite French toast. She said she was planning to go to school that day. I told her she didn't have to push herself. But she smiled brightly and said, "I'm fine now." I wondered what had changed, but decided to trust her and sent her off to school. "Have a good day," I said, though I was worried, and took the day off work. Around the time Sandra was supposed to come home, the doorbell rang suddenly. It was one of the high-floor residents. One of Rebecca's followers. She yelled at me, "What's wrong with your daughter? Get to the entrance now." How arrogant. Anyway, without understanding the situation, I went to the entrance and was shocked to see the high-floor and middle-floor residents in a massive brawl. Normally pristine and composed people were pulling each other's hair and screaming. Children were crying as they watched their parents go berserk. As I stood there in shock, one of the high-floor residents shouted at me, "How did you find out about this?" "About what?" I replied. "Sandra, what's going on?" I asked as she appeared. I wondered why she was there and realized she was the cause of all this. Come to think of it, that's why I was called here. The scene in front of me was so shocking I had forgotten. She had run into the high floor and middle floor kids while coming home through the entrance. As usual, one of the middle floor kids taunted, "The poor girl is back. Your parents are poor." But Sandra, unfazed, replied with a smile, "But your dads and moms are cheating on your families with other people here. A bunch of traitorous perverts." How did she know the word perverts? The kids didn't understand at first, but Sandra exposed that their parents were having affairs within the high-rise. The kids, initially in disbelief, became uneasy as Sandra confidently spoke, and they decided to confront their parents. The result was chaos. Rebecca was having an affair with Stacy's husband from the 12th floor, Lori's husband was cheating with Patrick's wife, and so on. Affairs were rampant, and the women were fighting over the men. Some, who weren't involved in the affairs, were furious and declared, "I'll sue every woman who had an affair with my husband." It was an ugly scene, like something out of a nightmare. As much as I felt sorry, I couldn't stop laughing. These people had been fighting over their spouses within the high-rise. But one thing bothered me. "Sandra, how did you know all this?" "I dreamt about it this morning. Most of them will probably leave the high-rise." She smiled at my question. I wanted to dismiss it, but seeing the chaos in front of me, it seemed plausible. Terrifyingly, some were even shouting, "Are you sure the child is really my husband's?" If they had been having affairs since moving into the high-rise, it wasn't impossible for there to be children around 5 years old. There seemed to be quite a few kids of that age here. I decided not to think about it. Apparently, the high floor and middle floor groups had been having regular home parties. Family socializing was common, and they all exchanged contact information. Ironically, these home parties had become places for starting affairs, leading to this mess. Some people had already noticed their spouses were cheating. Some were even preparing for lawsuits. Rebecca, in particular, seemed to have 5 affair partners within the high-rise. As expected of a leader. All the wives of these partners declared they would definitely sue her. Rebecca had turned pale. She kept shouting, "That's just a child's fantasy. I'm not cheating, unlike the others." But with so many affairs exposed, no one believed her. Her followers even turned on her, saying, "If you're panicking this much, it must be true." And I saw Rebecca walking with another man. Betrayers emerged one after another. Rebecca, being a prominent figure, had many enemies. Those who had seemed like her followers were now eagerly berating her. She was now the one being bashed by the high-rise residents. I felt oddly relieved. After all, we were bashed without doing anything wrong. Rebecca had been doing bad things behind the scenes. Though it was still a suspicion, her frantic behavior made it clear she was guilty. As I watched the women's fight, Sandra suddenly said, "Mom." "Yes," I replied. Amidst the commotion, Sandra murmured, "I think Tina's dad's company will go bankrupt too." "That's terrible." I didn't think it was possible. After all, Rebecca's husband was also having affairs with many people. Unlike Rebecca's alleged infidelity, this was confirmed. Several people were coming forward, claiming they had been involved with her husband. Rebecca's husband's company was well known, even advertising on TV. He had a famous model in his family, making the company somewhat prominent. If the president of such a company is having multiple affairs, the company's image would inevitably suffer. As Sandra predicted, it was easy to imagine the company going bankrupt. Rebecca, who mocked our family, might be the next to fall. As it wasn't good for Sandra's education, I decided to leave the scene, but Rebecca shouted, "Make Sandra say it was a lie!" Her predictions couldn't possibly be lies. I believed in Sandra. It was definitely true. A few days later, someone from the high-rise must have leaked the information. News about Rebecca and her husband's affairs appeared in the media. Along with that, more scandalous stories about Rebecca having relationships with 8 men in the high-rise, and even with some children's teachers, were exposed. Soon after, Rebecca moved out of our high-rise. I later heard that both Rebecca and her husband were being sued for their affairs and were now struggling financially. As Sandra had said, the company went bankrupt, they failed to pay their employees, and multiple lawsuits were filed against them, not just for infidelity but also for business matters. Rebecca and her husband tried to improve their image and the company's, but it was in vain. They continued to live separately. In the high-rise, lawsuits continued, with many families getting divorced and moving out. Sometimes, bosses and subordinates who lived in the high-rise and had affairs were fired, creating all sorts of chaos. Before I knew it, just as Sandra had predicted, more than half of the residents had changed, making our life much more comfortable. With new residents, there was no more silly competition over living on higher or lower floors. In fact, we sometimes had friendly home parties with other families living on the lower floors. Children who went to the same school as Sandra moved in, and our neighborhood relations were excellent. We were living the kind of life I had dreamed of before moving to the high-rise. We had a tough start, but now every day is enjoyable. Sandra has grown, and lately, she even helps me with dinner. She handles the housework better than I do, and both my husband and I are grateful to her. This Mother's Day, maybe I should thank Sandra instead. It's important to show appreciation every day. As Sandra grew older, her mysterious powers faded, and she would joke, "I wish I could have won the lottery before losing my powers." That's what she says. But it's said that excessive power can be self-destructive, so maybe it's better this way. Still, sometimes she says, "You should take an umbrella today," on perfectly clear mornings, only for it to pour in the afternoon. Perhaps she still has a bit of a strong intuition without realizing it. Regardless, she's a daughter with a mysterious charm. There were times I regretted living in the high-rise, but no matter where we live, I'm sure this family will always be happy. From now on, forever. Don't judge a book by its cover is something we were often told in elementary school, right? I remember my parents teaching me that lesson when I was growing up. It's true that you can't always tell what a person is like just by their appearance. However, there are people who don't realize this and constantly mock others. My name is Amy, I'm 30 years old. I live a typical life with my husband Charles, who works for a company, and our 6-year-old daughter Angela. I work part-time at a nearby supermarket about 4 days a week. Life is, well, so. We can't afford luxuries, but we're not struggling either. So, I'm satisfied with our current life. Amy, does your husband get a winter bonus? The economy is tough these days. Isn't it hard for you guys? The person who said this to me is Melissa. She is one of my friends and a leader in our group. Her followers, who were around her, looked me up and down and then laughed quietly. Today was an event at Angela's preschool. I thought I dressed appropriately, but maybe it was too plain. Amy, don't take it the wrong way. I just thought your outfit was plain, so you must be struggling financially. Working part-time just to make ends meet must be tough. Now she's mocking my part-time job too? I was about to explode, so I tried to leave quickly, but she didn't let me go. By the way, look at my bag. It's real leather. My husband insisted on giving it to me for my birthday. It cost $7,000, but for him, that's nothing. $7,000 is not cheap at all. I wanted to say, but I held back. Melissa, your husband is the CEO of a company, that's impressive. That's right. We can't afford such expensive things. Her followers eagerly flattered her. Feeling good, Melissa flaunted her bag in front of me and said, Amy, you should pay more attention to your appearance. Where did you buy those shabby clothes? And your bag, I've never seen that brand before. I guess that's all you can afford on a salary like your husband's. Angela must feel embarrassed with you looking so poor. She left after degrading me with a look of pity mixed with mockery. I forced a smile to get through the moment, but inside, I was seething with anger at Melissa's insensitivity. She's always like this. Melissa is a bit older than me, at 40. She's always curious about people's appearances, possessions, and Charles's job and salary, bombarding me with questions like a reporter while bragging about herself. I would never live on the lower floors. They seem so unsafe. The high-rise apartment we live in now is nice, but I wanted a higher floor. There was no vacancy, though. Oh, is this boring you, Amy? This is typical Melissa. It's outrageous to pry into another family's finances and then insert her own bragging at every opportunity. But common sense doesn't apply to her. She always acts like a queen with her entourage. I don't mind her comments about me. But I can't stand it when she belittles Charles, who works so hard to support our family. I wanted to tell her, mind your own business, you nosy woman. But saying that would obviously cause problems. So, I managed to get through it with a mature attitude. Melissa's husband is 12 years older than her and runs a company. According to Melissa, she worked hard to snag a wealthy husband. It's really sad for most people. Their husbands can't earn enough, so the wife and kids suffer. Compared to them, I'm so lucky. I have to be grateful to my husband. That's her usual refrain. Maybe some people think like that, but I can't agree with her words. Whenever the topic of Charles's job and income came up, I tried to evade her, but Melissa would quickly catch on. She's usually insensitive, but strangely perceptive in these matters. My parents were both government officials with high salaries, so I never had to struggle growing up. By the way, what do your parents do, Amy? This time, she brought up my parents to trap me. My dad runs a small factory, and my mom helps with the business. I tried to brush it off as casual conversation and leave, but she said, "A small factory? How sad." Her words were so insulting that I couldn't help but snap back. Sad? How so? Those kinds of jobs are for people who didn't study hard when they were young. Your father probably didn't put in the effort when he was younger, which is why he's in this situation now. Compared to him, my husband is brilliant. I was stunned by her audacity. My dad studied engineering in college and still works hard to earn certifications and incorporate new technologies into his work. He worked harder than anyone when he was young, and he still does. The person I respect most is undoubtedly my dad. So, I couldn't let Melissa's words go unchallenged. My dad is diligent and studious. Every day, he reads research papers and works hard to earn new qualifications. Just like Melissa's parents and husband, he's doing his best. Besides, without people working in small factories, our lives wouldn't function. How can you mock them like that? Perhaps it was because I raised my voice unusually, but Melissa's expression turned irritated as she raised her eyebrows and said, "You don't know how the world works, do you? Society has proper hierarchies. Don't lump together the common folks' jobs with those of my husband or parents." It's offensive. For the first time, I felt my blood boiling with anger. This is why I hate poor people who are struggling with money. Melissa left with those words, but my anger didn't subside. I thought I'd never speak to her again. But then, "Mom, have you been fighting with Nicole's mom lately?" Nicole is Melissa's daughter and a classmate of Angela's. "Why do you ask?" "Nicole's mom said you're poor and jealous because you're miserable. But I told her my mom is kind and doesn't fight." Angela asked proudly with a smile, and I was shocked. How could she say such things to a child? What kind of person does that? "Let's have a snack instead." Yay! I managed to distract Angela and took a deep breath. I really hate that woman. Is that so? That's just too much. Why should I be mocked by someone like that? Amy, calm down. One day, my parents visited our place, and I ended up venting my frustrations to them. Charles works hard every day, so I don't want to burden him with my complaints. So, my parents were the only ones I could talk to. "That friend of yours seems quite ignorant," Dad said calmly while drinking coffee. "She's not a friend. She's always bragging about living in a high-rise apartment and her brand-name goods. It's really annoying. Here, drink your coffee and take a deep breath. We didn't come here to talk about that today." Mom soothed me, and I regained my composure. "That's right. So, what did you want to talk about?" I remembered my parents had something important to tell me today. "Actually, we're thinking of selling the company and moving." "What? Why so suddenly? Did something happen?" I worried that something bad had happened. "No, it's nothing serious. We've both been working nonstop, and we thought it would be nice to have a more relaxed life in our old age. Besides, we thought we'd buy a house near where you live. You know the area well, right? Help us out." "It's fine, but isn't it dangerous for elderly people to live in the city?" I voiced my concern, and Dad scolded me. "Amy, we're only just turning 70. All right. Sorry about that. So, what kind of place do you want to live in?" "Well, actually," I was surprised by my parents' plans for the future. "Dad, you were thinking about that?" "Of course. You're our precious daughter, and we don't want you to struggle." Amy, please grant your dad's wish, Mom said, and I made up my mind. Fulfilling my aging parents' wishes is a form of filial piety, after all. All right. Thus, my parents sold the small factory in the countryside and moved close to our home. At the same time, my family decided to move to a house near my parents' new home. Charles, who had a good relationship with my parents, readily agreed to the idea. It's reassuring to have them nearby. It'll also help you feel better, Amy. Angela was excited too. New houses smell so good. We're living here from today. She was thrilled that the new place was more spacious than our old one and that Grandpa and Grandma's house was closer. The frustration and worry I had about Melissa dissipated when I saw Angela's smile. A new home, a new life, let's make the best of it. I thought this while checking the mailbox of our new house. Amy, what brings you to my house? I had run into someone I didn't want to see. Oh. Melissa, you live in this high-rise? Yes, on the 15th floor. Why are you here? Melissa looked at me with a puzzled expression. Are you planning to buy an apartment in this high-rise? You should reconsider. Even the lower floors aren't affordable for common folks. As she said this, she sneered at me as usual. She hasn't changed at all. Yes, we already live here. Don't worry about it. I said this casually, and she was stunned. You live here? It must be on the lower floors, right? She finally managed to get the words out. No, it's on the 25th floor. The view is great, and the interior is beautiful. High-rise living is the best. The 25th floor? There's no way a poor person like you can live there. If this is a joke, it's not funny. She was clearly agitated, but why was she so flustered? As we continued our exchange, my parents came down to the entrance by elevator. Amy, Mom and I are going shopping. Dad, Mom, let me introduce you. This is Melissa. She lives here too. Nice to meet you, and thank you for always taking care of Amy. My parents greeted her politely, but Melissa remained uneasy. She seemed to notice the expensive watch my dad was wearing and the high-end handbag my mom was carrying, staring at their belongings. These are my parents. They live on the 25th floor with us, so we'll be seeing more of each other. We'll be off then. After seeing my parents off, I turned to Melissa to say goodbye and head back to my apartment. Wait a minute. Your parents run a small factory, right? How can they afford to live here? I never said they were poor. That's quite rude, isn't it? But a small factory is where people with no skills or intelligence end up working. That's not the case for us. My husband went to a good university and worked hard to build his company. So why would such poor people live in the same high-rise? To her, her worldview was everything. Just hearing small factory made her think of poverty and lowly jobs. My parents are the same. They've worked hard to get where they are. And they're not poor. They paid for this apartment in cash and have plenty of savings for retirement. I didn't mention it, but my in-laws are also well off, and we're not struggling for money. My husband works hard and earns a decent salary, so we're content. I dress simply because I like it that way. It's not wise to judge people by their appearance or occupation. I declared firmly and walked away from her. This high-rise apartment was a gift from my dad. He believed it was better to convert the money from selling his company into real estate than to keep it all in cash. The amount was substantial, so I was hesitant to accept it, but I understood that it was a way to save on inheritance taxes in the future. Originally, my family lived in an apartment owned by my in-laws, but we moved to this high-rise apartment following my dad's suggestion. My parents had always wanted to live somewhere with a great view of the city, so we searched until we found the perfect place. My dad's sentiment of not wanting to burden Amy was rooted in his desire to avoid imposing a massive inheritance tax on me and to pass on assets while he was still alive. I gratefully accepted it, but I never expected such a development. Seeing Melissa's face like that was a first. She had always pitted me with a mean expression, looking down on me. The fact that the poor person she had scorned had moved in must have really bothered her. Well, after all I said, I doubt she'll bother me anymore. Did I flaunt our wealth too much? I thought for a moment, but since Melissa stopped contacting me, it was for the best. However, things took an unexpected turn. Did you hear? Melissa got divorced. Just 3 months after we moved into the high-rise, I heard this rumor from a friend. Apparently, Melissa's husband got fed up with her snobbish behavior. What happened? According to my friend, Melissa lived on the 15th floor of the high-rise, but shortly after we moved in, she suggested to her husband that they buy an apartment on the 30th floor. However, despite being a company executive, her husband, over 50 years old, couldn't get the loan approved due to income issues. That strained their marriage, and Melissa's spending worsened. Apparently, Melissa's husband woke up to the reality after she spent so much that their savings were nearly wiped out, leading to their divorce. I was so stunned by the news that I was speechless. Melissa's greed seemed limitless. After the divorce, Melissa moved back in with her parents, and she took her daughter out of preschool. Finally, I could live in peace. Melissa's remaining followers now tried to cozy up to me. Amy, you live in the high-rise where Melissa used to live, right? That's amazing. Can we visit sometime? Amy, you always look so nice. I thought you might be wealthy. Their sudden change in attitude was a bit annoying. After all, normal is best. Competing with others and showing off isn't for me. Charles and my parents agreed with me. We rented out the high-rise apartment and moved to a house a bit further away. Honestly, the high-rise apartment felt too grand for us, and having a house with a yard seemed more comfortable. A new house again. Now we can play in the yard with Dad and Mom. I felt a bit guilty about making my family move twice in a short period, but Angela seemed happy, so it was fine. Renting out the high-rise apartment brought in a steady income, allowing us to enjoy slightly better dinners. Still, the view from the high-rise made me feel a bit wealthy and was nice. Hey, Charles. In the end, normal is the best, right? Probably. As long as we can live peacefully together as a family, I'm happy anywhere. I nodded deeply at Charles's words. Having a loving family and living a peaceful, even if simple, life is the greatest happiness, I realized anew. I'm really disappointed in you, Malia. What? When we first met, you were so serious and reserved. It was a thrill trying to win you over. I was taken aback by what my husband, Greg, said. To him, I was nothing more than a challenging conquest. But if that's how he wants to play it, I won't hold back either. I don't want to continue this relationship with him anymore. I'll get the evidence I need and show you I can leave. He's in critical condition, unconscious. I don't have time to get caught up in this nonsensical situation. I'm not his wife. I'll make that clear and hit my real husband with divorce papers. My name is Malia. I'm 27 years old. Just your average office worker. I got married about a year ago, so I can't really call myself a newlywed anymore. My husband Greg, who's a year younger than me, works at one of our client companies. We met when we started working together on a joint project. To be frank, I thought he was handsome from the moment we met, but I didn't think much more of it at the time. I hate to toot my own horn, but I'm the type who's married to her job. Maybe that's why people say I give off an unapproachable vibe. I don't get people casually chatting with me outside of work very often. That's just how I am, so I've never had much luck in the romance department. And I figured that wasn't about to change. Malia, you're so cool. So reliable and all. During breaks at work, Greg would often flash me a smile and say things like that. At first, I wished he'd focus on his job instead of wasting time talking to me. But as he kept striking up conversations, my icy exterior gradually began to melt. He was so attentive in every way, and each time his kindness touched me, I could feel my heart waver. Before I knew it, I found myself dreading the end of our joint project. Apparently, he felt the same way. Would you maybe want to keep seeing each other? Like, outside of work and stuff? When he said that to me, I was overjoyed, to be honest. And so, we started dating, and ultimately got married after Greg proposed. Our newlywed life was a happy one, with no complaints. I still believe that. My family welcomed him warmly too, and I had no dissatisfaction to speak of. But recently, I started to sense that something was off. On the surface, our life was no different than before. But for some reason, at some point, it seemed like his gaze had lost the passion it once held. It's not that he completely lost interest in me, but it felt like it just wasn't the same as when we first started dating after the joint project ended. I figured that's normal after being married for a year. I tried to convince myself of that. But I just couldn't shake this uneasiness. Take the housework, for example. When we first got married, we'd take turns washing dishes and preparing meals. We also made a point of splitting the laundry and taking out the trash as much as possible to minimize the burden on each other. But lately, the frequency with which Greg did chores had decreased. Sorry, work's been crazy recently. It's true that Greg has been working a lot of overtime lately. I sighed heavily as I pondered her husband's recent behavior. Sure, he's been apologizing, and it's not like he's completely stopped helping out at home. But his busy season at work just ended not too long ago. So how can he still be so swamped? It doesn't add up, she thought, furrowing her brow in frustration. I hadn't been to his office in a while, so I couldn't really know the details of his work. I knew his company had started a new joint venture, but this time someone else was in charge of it. That person, Crystal, was apparently in the same class as Greg in college, but I had rarely spoken to her. As the daughter of a company executive, she seemed to have no interest in getting friendly with those around her. Rumor had it that she had been forcefully inserted into this project to establish a track record. But I couldn't be sure what the real story was. In any case, I and Crystal weren't close, so I had no idea about the current situation. She couldn't tell if his company was actually that busy right now. Maybe I was overthinking it. My own company, which was in a similar line of business, wasn't that hectic at the moment, so perhaps that's why it stood out to her. But there was something else bothering I that kept nagging at my thoughts. It was his body odor. Or rather, his lack thereof, even when he came home after working overtime. Instead of reeking of sweat, he smelled pleasantly fresh, as if he had just showered. His office did have a small shower room installed, so it wasn't that strange. I wanted to believe that, but then something else didn't add up. I'm exhausted. I'm gonna go rinse off this sweat, he would say as soon as he got home, heading straight for the shower. But if he had already showered at work, why would he need to do that? It's not like he took the crowded subway. Greg commuted by car. Moreover, in all the time I had known him, he had never been the type to be that diligent about his personal hygiene. I had certainly never seen him use the office shower room to freshen up. And that's why it just didn't sit right with me. Do you think that's okay? Grant, a younger male coworker at I's company, asked her that question in the employee cafeteria. It felt strange for I to now be in a position of mentoring others, when not so long ago she had been the new hire herself. Grant was honestly a bit clumsy, so I had to watch over him quite closely. Today, too, I had been pointing out his various mistakes, and before I knew it, it was already lunchtime. They had agreed to grab a quick bite separately and then get back to work. But noticing I's gloomy expression, Grant had insisted on having lunch together. I hadn't intended to share her personal issues. But pressured by Grant, I had ended up spilling the whole story. Maybe I was just a pushover. Or maybe this situation was weighing on her more heavily than she had realized. I wasn't sure which it was. In any case, as I reluctantly explained her circumstances, Grant seemed perplexed. Unable to gauge the meaning behind his reaction, I questioned him. Okay with what? Well, you know. He shifted uncomfortably, as if he didn't want to say it. It seemed to be a sensitive topic, but having come this far, I needed to get to the bottom of it. Just spit it out. Rubbing the back of his head, Grant reluctantly shared his thoughts. Coming home late from work, neglecting housework, being kind of cold lately. Aren't those all common signs of cheating? I was stunned into silence by his blunt assessment. He was absolutely right. That combination of factors was a textbook cheating scenario, the kind you see in novels and dramas all the time. Sure, once in a while there's a story where it turns out the husband was actually working hard for his family's sake and the couple's relationship is great. But the vast majority of the time, it means he's having an affair. I felt ashamed for not realizing it sooner. Or maybe I just didn't want to think about it, even though deep down I knew. He is cheating on me. I'm sorry. It's just speculation on my part. No, it's okay. Thank you. I said softly, expressing my gratitude to Grant. If he hadn't pointed it out, I might have turned a blind eye to it forever. As a token of my appreciation, I paid for his lunch and left the cafeteria early. I needed to gather my thoughts before resuming work. In reality, I think there's a pretty good chance Greg is having an affair. The thought stirred up a whirlwind of emotions inside me. Now that I've become aware of it, I can't just leave things as they are. It would be impossible to focus on work or even carry on with my normal life. I'll try talking to him directly about it when I get home. With that decision made, I was finally able to regain some semblance of peace of mind. Somehow, I managed to get through the rest of the workday and headed home when it was time. By the time I arrived at our apartment in the fading light, Greg hadn't returned yet. Time seemed to crawl by agonizingly slowly as I waited, but Greg was nowhere to be seen. I'm home. Another grueling day of overtime. Greg walked through the door after 11 p.m., announcing his arrival. Once again, his body didn't have much of an odor. No, if anything, I thought I detected a pleasant fragrance emanating from him. Feeling unsettled, I took his jacket as he headed for the shower. I'm sorry. I mumbled apologetically as I searched the pockets of his jacket. I desperately hoped I wouldn't find anything. But my wish was tragically betrayed. From the inner pocket of Greg's jacket, I pulled out a single condom. There's no reason for him to have that in his work jacket. It's not like he's in a situation where someone would give him one. If he bought it for our intimate moments, it's strange that there's only one. In that case, it should be an unopened box. Unless there's some other explanation I can't even imagine. I'll have to hear it straight from his mouth. My resolve solidified, I stopped Greg as he was getting ready for bed after his shower. Oh, what is it, Malia? His face was completely nonchalant, not at all the expression of a cheating husband. Honestly, I hesitated to even ask. But I couldn't ignore these feelings gnawing at me.
I found this in your jacket pocket. What's the meaning of it?
Driven by those thoughts, I directly confronted him with my doubts. Maybe I didn't need to ask so bluntly. But I wanted to face Greg head-on. I had hoped he would do the same for me. But that hope was swiftly shattered. So, what do you think it means, Malia?
What?
Greg's response wasn't an excuse or an honest answer. It was a twisted, mocking retort. You think this proves I'm cheating on you?
Why else would I be asking you?
And that was the literal truth. Based on the circumstances, it was pretty much confirmed, but I didn't know for certain which it was. That's why I wanted Greg to tell me in his own words, so I could know for sure. But it seemed Greg had no intention of doing that.
Aren't you going to say you trust me or something? I want to trust you. That's why I'm trying to get this straight.
Then just keep on trusting me, plain and simple. I was at a loss for words at his incredibly irresponsible statement.
Are you telling me to overlook your cheating?
That's not what I'm saying. Take it however you want. But if you're calling it cheating, show me some clear evidence. If I had that kind of proof, I wouldn't be asking him about it in the first place. Greg must know that too. He just flashed a smug smile. Faced with his attitude, all I could do was stammer. If you don't have anything, then don't bother asking. Greg shrugged at me as I struggled to find my voice. I gotta say, I'm disappointed in you, Malia.
What?
When we first met, you seemed so guarded that it was a thrill to win you over. What is he talking about? I couldn't quite grasp what Greg meant. No, I didn't want to understand. I refused to comprehend words that made it sound like he thought of our relationship, our marriage, as some kind of game. I thought staying married would keep things interesting, but not so much. Well, it's easy for me to handle at least.
What are you saying?
Nothing really. Just that being married to you turned out to be more boring than I expected. After that dismissive comment, he let out a sleepy yawn. Not the demeanor of a man being interrogated about infidelity. But I was so stunned that my mind was reeling, unable to find my next words. Then, in a perfectly normal tone, he told me, "If you want a divorce, make sure you bring some real evidence. I don't want to waste my time." With that, he left me standing there and went into his room. Greg slept in his own room on days he worked late, claiming he got too wound up and never knew when he would fall asleep. But I could no longer believe it was just overtime. However, so thoroughly deceived, I could only watch blankly as he walked away. From that day on, our daily life underwent a drastic change. The biggest difference was in his attitude toward me. He stopped doing the bare minimum of housework he used to do. I could no longer sense any of the attentiveness from when we first met. And he was clearly looking at me with a contemptuous gaze. He kept coming home late, insisting it was overtime, with that expression and demeanor. In truth, I must be an idiot. Considering his cheating and treatment of me, I have no reason to handle his share of the chores or prepare his meals. But I couldn't cut him off completely because of our memories together. I kept doing the housework as always and continuing our life together. I clung to the faint hope that someday he would go back to how he was when we first got married. Then one day, it happened.
Who could that be?
Once again, Greg came home late, claiming it was due to overtime. I should have just gone to bed, but I waited up until the doorbell rang at 9 p.m. Greg has a key, so there's no need for him to ring the doorbell. Wondering who it could be, I peered through the peephole and saw a woman standing there. She had a somewhat frumpy overall appearance.
"Excuse me, who are you?"
I asked through the door. The woman looked a bit startled, then opened her mouth to speak.
"Are you Greg's wife?" Yes, I am. I'm the woman who got involved with your husband, Greg.
I was shocked by her sudden declaration. To openly admit to the affair and show up at our home like this. But something wasn't right. Greg still wasn't home yet today either. I had already confirmed with an acquaintance from when we worked together that Greg's current company wasn't particularly busy. Meaning he should be out cheating right now. So it was strange that his affair partner was here. Perplexed, I decided to let her in and hear her out. The woman, Amelia, apparently works at a subcontractor for Greg's company. She said that through their business interactions, Greg treated her kindly and she developed feelings for him, eventually confessing.
Sure, I've never met a girl like you before.
They got physically involved a few times after that, but
I didn't know he was married.
Amelia cast her eyes downward apologetically as we talked in the living room. It seems he never mentioned me before starting the affair. When Amelia found out later, she felt terrible, but contrary to those feelings, she couldn't easily end her attachment to him. Not knowing what to do, aware it was wrong, she looked up our address and came here today. To apologize in front of me, explain the situation, and talk it out. Normally, I should probably be angry at her too. But more than that, I had found a new target for my explosive rage. None other than Greg. Hearing Amelia's story completely severed any lingering attachment I had to him. Greg cheated on me, his wife, and then went after Amelia on top of that. The things Amelia told me, contrasted with what he said to me, I finally understood. Greg approaches women like it's all a game to him. I felt like a fool for trying to engage earnestly with someone like that. I concluded I needed to leave him as soon as possible. And with that, sympathy clearly won out over any other feelings toward her.
Amelia, there's something I need to tell you. What is it?
I proceeded to tell her everything she needed to know.
You absolutely must cut ties with him immediately. For your own good.
That included enlisting her cooperation for my divorce. By the end of our conversation, Amelia too was filled with the same fury I felt. A week passed after that incident.
It should be about time.
Greg claimed overtime again today, but everyone knows that's not true. In that case, now was the perfect opportunity to test that out. I took out my smartphone.
Huh?
Just then, the rarely used landline phone started ringing loudly. I wonder who it could be, I thought as I answered the phone. A tense male voice came through from the other end.
Is this the residence of Greg Weiler? Yes, it is. But who is this?
I asked, furrowing my brow, honestly unable to grasp the situation. The caller identified himself as a hospital staff member, stated the name of the hospital, and then delivered unthinkable news.
Please remain calm as you hear this. About 10 minutes ago, Greg Weiler was brought into our hospital. He's in critical condition, unconscious. What? I understand it's hard to believe. But it's the truth.
The man's voice was so solemn it made me uncomfortable. But honestly, I was skeptical. I knew it. The smartphone in my hand displayed the location of the GPS tracker I had secretly placed in Greg's car the other day to gather evidence of his infidelity. It currently showed the car parked at a hotel. I had inadvertently obtained one piece of proof of his cheating, but that also meant the Greg Weiler the hospital staff was talking about wasn't the person I knew. So I clearly informed the caller.
That's not my husband. What? But Dash. I'm terribly sorry, but there must be some mistake. Please contact someone else.
With that, I hung up the phone. I did feel bad for that Greg Weiler. All I could do was hope he would be all right. But putting that aside, I had my own issues to deal with. I checked the location on my smartphone again and took a taxi to the hotel where Greg and his affair partner were likely to be. I wanted to catch them in a photo if possible as they exited the hotel. Even if I was too late, I could at least confirm the location. It would save me one step, whether I staked it out myself later or hired a private investigator. My destination turned out to be a slightly run-down hotel in a seedy area. Peeking into the parking lot, I saw his car was indeed there. This alone could serve as evidence, but knowing Greg, he might just feign ignorance with a straight face. I wanted to firmly secure proof if I could. With that in mind, I hid near the hotel entrance for a while, waiting for Greg and his partner to come out, but that's strange. No matter how long I waited, they never emerged. Instead, my smartphone kept ringing incessantly. The number was from the hospital that had called my home. I figured this was probably another misunderstanding, but then it hit me. They likely got my home and cell number from the smartphone of this Greg Weiler who was brought to the hospital. But would my number and home phone be in some other Weiler's smartphone? No, that's not possible. I muttered to myself, refuting my own assumption. Which means the Greg in the hospital was the Greg I knew. But his car was here. And that's precisely why I had been convinced this whole time that the person taken to the hospital was someone else. I had no idea what was going on. Just then, a number other than the hospital appeared on my smartphone screen. It was Denny, Greg's father. I decided I shouldn't ignore this call and answered.
Malia? Where are you right now?
According to Denny, he was calling on behalf of the hospital. It seems the Greg who was taken to the hospital is indeed the one I know. Since I had completely ignored their calls, they must have gone through all the contacts in Greg's smartphone. As a result, they reached out to Denny and the others, and finally got in touch with me. That's what I figured happened. Which means, after some thought, I replied,
the place Greg was at before being taken to the hospital. It's a hotel.
In other words, something happened to Greg here, and as a result he was rushed to the hospital. His car was left behind because there was no time to ask a tow truck or acquaintance to handle it. So inadvertently, I had obtained the ultimate circumstantial evidence to prove his infidelity. The emergency responders who transported him would have no reason to lie about where they found the patient.
I see.
Denny's voice sounded somewhat strained in response to my answer. He had probably already asked for details about where Greg was transported from and the overall situation. Meaning Denny must be aware by now that Greg was cheating. I felt bad for him, but in a way it sped things along, which was a relief. Ignoring the phone calls turned out to be a good thing in the end. But putting that aside, why did he end up being taken to the hospital in the first place?
For now, Greg is all right. He's regained consciousness, but...
Denny trailed off and was silent for a while. It seemed to be a situation that was difficult to put into words. I told Denny I would contact him later for more details, and then headed to the hospital they had called from. Perhaps because there were limited options for emergency transport, it was quite a distance from the hotel. I'd make sure to bill Greg for the taxi fare later. With that resolve, I arrived at the hospital to find a situation that almost made me want to laugh. Greg was sitting on a bed near the entrance. The smug look that had mocked me so much was nowhere to be seen on his face. He was blushing beet red and staring at the floor, looking extremely uncomfortable. And Denny and my mother-in-law Rachel were glaring at Greg, barely containing their anger. Their slightly flushed faces were likely due to rage. As I stepped into the room, still confused by the situation, Greg noticed me.
Malia! Please, mediate between me and Dad and the others.
His first words were about his own convenience, not an apology or remorse. I could only be appalled. I never intended to from the start, but any pity I had left for him in my heart completely vanished in that moment.
Huh? Mediate what? Don't tell me it's about the fact that you were cheating. Well, you see. Just so you know, I already confirmed your car abandoned at the hotel.
At my scathing words, the color drained from Greg's face. Meanwhile, my in-laws' faces grew even redder.
I'll double-check with the hospital staff to be sure, but the fact that you were cheating is now irrefutable.
I wouldn't mention the other evidence I had yet. But even without revealing that, he had no way out now. He seemed to realize that. He slumped his shoulders and shrank into himself. It was as if his overconfident demeanor from just a short while ago had been a lie.
More importantly, first explain what happened.
Greg trembled at my sharp rebuke and slowly began to explain the circumstances. Once again claiming overtime to me, Greg had gone to the hotel with his affair partner. They got a bit hungry, so they ate some sandwiches the woman had brought. Then they washed up and used some lubricant to make the act easier before getting intimate. It was at that very moment. An indescribable, intense sensation apparently assaulted the area where they had applied the lubricant. A strange feeling of heat and cold they had never experienced before washed over them, throwing both into total confusion. But that wasn't the only thing that happened to the two of them. In the midst of their agonized writhing, a sudden urge to defecate struck. Even if they tried to make it to the toilet somehow, the bewildering situation made it nearly impossible to walk. As for what ended up happening, it turned into quite a miserable spectacle. The affair partner barely managed to call an ambulance, but he was foaming at the mouth and lost consciousness. However, this seemed to be due not to the physical anomalies, but rather to him being completely distraught from the terror and panic of the incomprehensible situation, combined with the humiliation of soiling himself. In other words, the enormity of the mental shock caused him to fall into a critical, unconscious state. Furthermore, the hotel staff and paramedics witnessed the two of them in that awful condition. On top of that, the affected area where something had occurred was thoroughly cleansed at the hospital. For Greg, who had always acted so high and mighty, the mortifying embarrassment must have been far greater than we could imagine. Moreover, that situation, which could only be described as disgraceful, was no doubt explained to my in-laws in meticulous detail. The reason for their persistently flushed faces was likely not only anger but also embarrassment. Imagining the humiliation Greg was feeling now, I honestly had to fight the urge to burst out laughing. If my in-laws hadn't been there, I probably would have pointed at him and guffawed. Incidentally, the mysterious sensations and bowel urges had apparently subsided completely by this point. There would likely be no lingering symptoms.
That must have been quite an ordeal.
I somehow managed to suppress the laughter that threatened to erupt. Greg must have noticed, as he hung his head in chagrin. I could imagine that something had been mixed into the lubricant. As for the urge to defecate, perhaps it was simply due to some bad food combination? Since the police hadn't been contacted yet, the details were unknown. However, there was one thing that could be said with certainty.
But I have no sympathy for you. This is punishment for your cheating.
Unable to refute my point, he let out a groan. At the very least, if he hadn't cheated, he never would have ended up in this situation. There was no way around the fact that it was entirely his own fault for suffering unnecessary humiliation.
Malia, I'm truly sorry for my foolish son.
With those words, Denny and Rachel beside him deeply apologized to me. I had no intention of blaming my in-laws. I hurriedly tried to reassure them.
Please, stop apologizing. Denny, Rachel, you two did nothing wrong. The one at fault is...
No matter how you looked at it, the ones to blame were the people who couldn't understand the obvious fact that they shouldn't cheat. As I thought that and was about to lay into Greg again, it happened.
"You're the one at fault."
From beyond the bed where Greg sat, the curtain dividing the room was pulled back to reveal an unexpected person.
"Crystal!"
That's right. There stood my coworker Crystal, dressed in a hospital gown. Considering that we were in the same hospital room, and given the situation, I voiced my speculation.
"Don't tell me his affair partner is..." "It's not an affair. I'm Greg's true girlfriend."
As Crystal declared this vehemently, her shoulders trembling, my in-laws were stunned speechless and Greg clutched his head. While we were still reeling in shock, Crystal launched into an impassioned speech. According to her own perception, people apparently kept their distance from Crystal because she was the daughter of a company executive. From our perspective, it was clearly Crystal who was keeping her distance from us. In any case, Greg apparently treated her kindly as well, and before long they were passionately in love, or so she claimed. To Crystal, he must have been a knight in shining armor. Whereas to me, my impression of him had become nothing more than that of a fickle, unfaithful man.
"Greg, you said your diligent wife who earnestly handles both housework and her job is boring."
As Crystal spoke with a boastful air, my in-laws wore expressions of utter disbelief. Perhaps somewhere in their hearts, they had wanted to believe there was some reason for Greg's infidelity, that is to say, that I was also part of the problem. But now, realizing the issue lay in their son's way of thinking, they seemed to be at a loss for words. Seeing his parents' increasingly grim expressions directed at him, Greg's face turned even paler.
"In that regard, I'm exciting indifferent from her."
"Oh, is that so? Then Crystal, if you marry Greg, you won't do any housework?"
"Of course not."
Crystal puffed out her chest with confidence, but fury from an unexpected source pierced through her.
"Are you an idiot?"
None other than Greg's mother. Rachel's body shook with rage as she exploded at Crystal.
"What do you mean, idiot? What's wrong with calling an idiot an idiot?"
As Crystal tried to lunge at her, Rachel silenced her with an overwhelming intensity.
"A married couple is meant to support each other through life together. And you. Both you and Greg."
It was the first time I had seen Rachel so incensed. Perhaps it was a first for Greg as well. He was visibly trembling, evident even to an onlooker. Denny's face also seemed to be turning slightly pale.
"You should be ashamed of calling it boring to sincerely devote yourself to your partner. Ashamed. Why do I have to be told that by a stranger like you?"
Though she should have stopped, Crystal still tried to argue back. Rachel unleashed another blistering rebuke at her. I was truly grateful we were the only ones in the hospital room.
"Shut your mouth!"
Seeing Crystal let out another scream-like cry, Rachel heaved a sigh of utter exasperation.
"If you were to marry Greg, I would become your mother-in-law, you know?" "Oh!"
As if the thought had never even occurred to her until now, Crystal bit her lip and hung her head at this point.
To argue back without even considering that. "At the very least, I will not approve of him marrying her, Greg."
"No, I have no intention of marrying her."
"What? What do you mean?"
Perhaps thinking he could ingratiate himself with Rachel, Greg spoke evasive words. Right at that moment, another person appeared. "I'm sure that's the case. That's the kind of person you are." It was Amelia, his other affair partner. Gone was the somewhat timid and gentle aura Amelia had when I first met her. She stared at Greg with a gaze conveying the depths of her hatred and resentment.